Zara Langley crouched beside the trembling golden retriever, her gentle hands stroking his matted fur as she whispered soothing words. "You're safe now, buddy," she murmured, her voice filled with warmth. The shelter had taken him in just last night, another abandoned soul in need of love. "Zara, we have a visitor," called out her coworker Lisa from the front desk. Zara stood, brushing stray dog hair from her jeans before stepping into the lobby. That was when she saw him. A man stood near the entrance, his broad shoulders filling the space effortlessly. Dark hair tousled in a way that looked both effortless and intentional, piercing blue eyes scanning the shelter with quiet intensity. He was dressed casually, dark jeans, a fitted sweater, but something about him radiated confidence, a presence that was impossible to ignore. She had no idea she was staring until he turned, catching her gaze. A slow, easy smile spread across his face. "Hi," he said, his voice rich and smooth. "I heard you have dogs in need of a home." Zara blinked, regaining her composure. "Yes, we do. Are you looking for a particular breed?" The man shook his head. No preference, just looking. Something about his hesitance struck her as odd. Most people who came in had a clear idea of what they wanted, but he seemed uncertain, as if he wasn't here just for a dog, but for something else entirely. "I'm Zara," she introduced herself, extending a hand. "Matthias Holden," he replied, shaking her hand briefly. His grip was firm, warm. Zara turned towards the kennels, motioning for him to follow. "Come on, I'll show you around." As they walked, she stole glances at him. There was something refined about the way he carried himself, despite his casual attire. He moved like a man who was used to control, but there was a softness in his eyes when he looked at the dogs. "This one here is Daisy," Zara said, stopping by a kennel where a shy Labrador mix peered up at them. "She was found abandoned in a park. She's a little wary of new people, but she warms up quickly." Matthias crouched down, extending a hand through the bars. "Hey there, sweetheart," he murmured. Daisy sniffed his fingers, then hesitantly licked them. Zara arched a brow. "She doesn't usually trust people this fast." Matthias shrugged, standing up. "Maybe she knows I need her as much as she needs me." His words made something twist in Zara's chest. "Are you looking to adopt?" "I'm considering it," he admitted. "But I'd like to come back a few times before making a decision, see if we're the right fit." "That's a great approach," Zara said, genuinely pleased. Too many people made impulsive choices when adopting, only to return the dog weeks later. As they continued walking, Matthias asked, "How long have you worked here?" 3 years now," she replied. "It started as a volunteer thing, but I fell in love with it." "Why?" Zara glanced at him. "Because they need someone to fight for them, to love them when no one else does." Matthias was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's admirable." Zara felt warmth creep up her neck at the sincerity in his voice. They reached the last kennel, where a small terrier mix wagged its tail excitedly. Matthias chuckled, crouching down again. "And who's this little guy?" "That's Benji, he's a troublemaker." Matthias gave the dog an affectionate pat. "I like him already." Zara laughed, and Matthias turned his gaze to her. There was something in his expression, something unreadable but intense. It made her breath catch. "Would it be okay if I came by again tomorrow?" he asked. "Of course," she said, her voice softer than she intended. As he walked out of the shelter, Zara found herself watching him go, an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. She had no idea that Matthias Holden was a millionaire. And she had no clue that he had just fallen hard for her. The next day, Zara was unloading a stack of donated blankets when the familiar deep voice reached her ears. "Need a hand?" She turned to find Matthias standing just inside the shelter's entrance, hands casually tucked into the pockets of his jeans. His presence filled the space effortlessly, an easy confidence in the way he carried himself. Yet there was something else, a quiet attentiveness, as if he was studying her reaction. Zara smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You're back. You sound surprised," he said, stepping closer. "Most people don't follow through." Matthias tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "I'm not most people." There was something in the way he said it, steady, certain, that made her stomach tighten unexpectedly. She handed him a couple of the blankets, and they worked side by side, placing them in the storage bins. "So did you come to visit Daisy and Benji?" Zara asked once they were done. Matthias nodded. "Yeah. I figured they might be wondering if I'd show up again." Zara led him back to the kennels, stealing a glance at him as they walked. There was a quiet thoughtfulness in him, something that didn't quite match the effortless charm he projected. As soon as they reached the enclosure, Benji yipped excitedly, bouncing on his tiny paws. Matthias crouched, letting the dog lick his fingers through the bars, a genuine warmth in his expression. "He remembers you," Zara observed. Matthias chuckled. "I'd be offended if he didn't." Daisy, more hesitant, peeked from the back of her kennel, watching him carefully. He didn't rush her. Instead, he simply sat on the floor, resting his arms on his knees, waiting. Zara was impressed. Most people tried too hard, eager for instant affection, but Matthias was patient. After a few moments, Daisy crept forward, sniffing his outstretched hand before nudging it lightly. Zara felt an unexpected flicker of emotion. "You have a way with them," she said softly. Matthias glanced up at her, his blue eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Maybe because I understand them." Zara frowned slightly, sensing a weight behind his words, but before she could ask, he stood, brushing off his jeans. "I was thinking," he said. "Maybe you could help me figure out which one would be the best fit for me." Zara hesitated. "That's really up to you. It depends on what you're looking for." Matthias studied her for a beat. "What if I don't know?" She crossed her arms, thoughtful. "Well, what's your lifestyle like? Are you home a lot, or do you travel?" Matthias hesitated just for a second. "I travel sometimes," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "But when I'm home, I want someone waiting for me." Zara's heart gave the slightest lurch at the way he said it, as if he wasn't just talking about a dog. Before she could dwell on it, a voice called from the front desk. "Zara, we need you for a minute." She glanced back at Matthias. "I'll be right back." As she walked off, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Matthias than he let on. Something about him didn't quite fit. He was too polished, too composed, despite the casual clothes and easy demeanor. But why would a man like him, someone who carried himself with such quiet authority, be here, hesitating over a dog? When she returned, Matthias was still sitting with Daisy, his fingers absently tracing circles on the floor. "You're good with them," she said again, leaning against the kennel. He glanced up, a slow smile curving his lips. "You keep saying that like it surprises you." Zara shrugged. "Most people don't have the patience." Matthias exhaled, glancing at Daisy. "Maybe that's something I'm trying to change." There it was again, that underlying weight in his words, like there was something more, something unsaid. Before she could press further, he stood, brushing his hands together. "I should probably get going." "Will we see you again?" Matthias met her gaze. "Yeah, tomorrow." And just like that, he was gone. Zara exhaled, running a hand through her hair. She wasn't sure what it was about Matthias Holden, but she had a feeling that whatever had brought him here, it wasn't just about a dog. The next afternoon, Zara stepped into the shelter's main room just as Matthias walked through the entrance. There was something about the way he moved, unhurried but deliberate, that made her pulse hitch slightly. "You're becoming a regular," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans after finishing up with the morning feeding. Matthias slid his hands into his pockets, his gaze warm. "That a bad thing?" Zara shook her head. "Not at all, it's just unexpected." For a moment he didn't respond, his expression contemplative. Then, as if deciding something, he gestured toward the kennels. "I was thinking about taking Daisy for a walk." "If that's allowed," her brows lifted slightly. "It is, but she still gets nervous outside the shelter," Matthias nodded. "Then maybe she just needs someone patient." Something about the way he said it made a warmth spread through Zara's chest. Without another word, she grabbed a leash and led him toward Daisy's kennel. The Labrador mix hesitated when Matthias entered, her ears perking up uncertainly. He crouched down, taking his time, offering his hand without expectation. Zara watched as Daisy inched forward, sniffing cautiously before nudging into his palm. Matthias' lips parted slightly, almost as if surprised by the connection. "She trusts you," Zara murmured. He clipped on the leash, giving Daisy space as she adjusted to the idea of leaving. Zara couldn't help but notice the patience in his movements. He had a way of reading the dog's hesitation, never rushing her, never forcing. They stepped outside into the crisp air, the city's muted hum in the background. Daisy walked tentatively at first, ears twitching at passing sounds, but Matthias kept his pace slow, letting her set the rhythm. "You're good at this," Zara said after a few minutes. Matthias glanced sideways at her. "You sound surprised again." Zara exhaled a quiet laugh. "It's just... most people don't take the time to understand what the dog needs." He was quiet for a beat. Then, almost absently, he said, "Maybe I know what it's like to be cautious about trust." Zara studied him for a moment. There was something unspoken in his words, something deeper than what he was letting on. She decided to ask, "You've been careful with what you share about yourself?" Matthias didn't answer right away. Instead, he steered Daisy toward a small grassy patch, watching as she sniffed curiously. Finally, he exhaled. "Old habit." Zara tilted her head. "Why?" He hesitated, then met her gaze. "Because sometimes, when people know who I am, they see something different than what's real." The weight of his words settled between them, and for the first time, Zara felt the distinct sensation that there was something about Matthias Holden she hadn't even begun to uncover. Daisy tugged at the leash, breaking the moment. Matthias knelt beside her, scratching behind her ears. His expression softened. "She's going to be okay," he murmured. Zara wasn't sure if he was talking about the dog or himself. As they made their way back to the shelter, the air between them felt different, charged with something unspoken, something shifting. When they reached the entrance, Matthias hesitated before handing the leash back. "I think she's the one." Zara's heart gave a strange little twist. "You're sure?" Matthias nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, I want to take her home." She should have been thrilled. She was thrilled. But as she locked eyes with him, she couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had changed, and she wasn't sure what it meant. The adoption process moved faster than Zara expected. Matthias filled out the paperwork with an efficiency that suggested he was used to making things happen on his terms. There was no hesitation in his decision, no second guessing. He wanted Daisy, and Zara had no doubt he would give her the kind of home she deserved. Yet, as she watched him attach the new collar around Daisy's neck, a strange heaviness settled in her chest. He would take her home today. That meant no more daily visits, no more quiet conversations in the shelter's back room, no more stolen glances that lingered too long. She pushed the thought aside, forcing a smile as she knelt beside Daisy, scratching gently behind her ears. The dog leaned into her touch, though her tail wagged excitedly at Matthias' side. "This is a big change for you," Zara murmured to Daisy, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the dog or herself. Matthias crouched beside them, his shoulder nearly brushing hers. His voice was softer than usual. "For both of us." She glanced at him, startled by the quiet intensity in his expression. There was something unreadable in his eyes, something that made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't fully understand. Daisy nudged Matthias' hand, drawing his attention back to her, and the spell between them broke. He stood, adjusting the leash as he reached for the adoption folder Zara had prepared. "I'll take good care of her," he said, his voice steady, reassuring. Zara nodded, swallowing the sudden lump in her throat. "I know you will." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, as if something was waiting to be said, something just out of reach. But then Matthias exhaled, giving the leash a gentle tug. "Come on, Daisy," he murmured. The Labrador mix hesitated for only a second before following him toward the door. Zara watched as they stepped outside, the crisp autumn air swirling around them. Then, just before he disappeared around the corner, Matthias glanced back. His gaze held hers for a heartbeat, something unspoken passing between them, and then he was gone. The shelter was quieter without him. Zara hadn't realized how much she had started to anticipate his visits until they stopped. Days passed, then a full week, and though she told herself she had no reason to expect him to return, there was a small, stubborn part of her that hoped he might. But he didn't. She told herself it was normal. He had Daisy now. He didn't need to come back. Still, the absence of him was something she felt more than she wanted to admit. Then, late one evening, just as she was locking up, a familiar figure appeared outside the shelter's entrance. Matthias. Zara's breath caught as he stepped toward her, a leash in one hand, Daisy trotting happily at his side. She stared at him, caught between surprise and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. "You're here," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Matthias glanced down at Daisy, then back at her. "She missed you." Zara's heart clenched at the simple words. Daisy whined softly, pulling toward her, and Zara knelt immediately, running her hands through the dog's soft fur. "I missed you too, sweetheart," she whispered. When she looked up, Matthias was watching her, his expression unreadable. She stood slowly, waiting for him to explain why he had come back. Instead, he took a step closer, his free hand sliding into his jacket pocket as if he were steadying himself. "I didn't just come for Daisy," he admitted. Zara's pulse quickened. "I tried to stay away," he continued, his voice quieter now. "Told myself I had no reason to come back. But the truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about you." She exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening against Daisy's collar. Matthias took another step forward, close enough now that she could see the way his jaw tensed, the way his eyes searched hers. "I don't want to be just another visitor you forget about," he said. "I want more than that." Zara felt her world tilt slightly, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. For the first time, she let herself acknowledge what had been building between them from the start. The quiet tension, the lingering glances, the way her heart had started to beat differently whenever he was near. She swallowed hard. "Matthias." He shook his head as if he already knew whatever hesitation she was about to voice. "I know this isn't what you expected," he said. "I know I'm probably the last person you thought would walk back through that door, but I'm here." She searched his face, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. Daisy let out a small huff, nudging between them as if nudging them closer. Zara laughed softly, the sound breaking the tension just enough. Matthias' lips curved slightly, but his gaze never wavered from hers. "Let me take you to dinner," he said. "No expectations." "Just us?" Zara hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because something about this felt too big, too real. But when she looked at him, really looked at him, she saw something that made her decision easier than she expected. He wasn't just asking for a date, he was asking for a chance. Slowly, she nodded. Matthias let out a breath as if he had been holding it, and for the first time since meeting him, she saw something unguarded in his expression. Relief, hope, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something neither of them had been expecting. The restaurant was unlike anything Zara had ever stepped into. Warm ambient lighting reflected off sleek marble floors, and soft instrumental music played in the background. The air carried the scent of expertly crafted dishes, rich with spices and herbs. It was elegant, intimate, far removed from the cozy cafes she usually frequented. Matthias pulled out a chair for her, his touch featherlight as she settled into the plush seat. Across from her, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent but easy, as if he were studying her reaction without putting pressure on her. She let out a breath, forcing herself to relax. "This place is," she searched for the right word, "beautiful?" A ghost of a smile flickered across his lips. "I wanted somewhere quiet, just us." A waiter appeared, placing 2 glasses of deep red wine on the table. Zara could tell just from the aroma that it was something expensive, far beyond what she would ever order for herself. Matthias didn't even glance at the menu before giving a slight nod to the waiter, who took their selections without needing further instruction. She arched a brow at him once they were alone again. "Do you come here often?" His fingers traced the rim of his glass thoughtfully. "Every now and then, mostly for business." Zara tilted her head. "What kind of business?" The corner of his mouth curved, but this time it wasn't teasing. It was as if he were weighing how much to say. Then, after a pause, he answered, "Investments." "Acquisitions." The words were simple, but something in the way he said them carried weight. Zara's mind shifted, piecing things together. The way he carried himself, the effortless way he had arranged the night without hesitation, the quiet authority in his voice when he spoke. He wasn't just successful, he was powerful. And suddenly she realized he had never told her exactly how much. Her fingers curled around the stem of her glass. "You're not just comfortable," she said carefully. "Are you?" Matthias exhaled, setting his glass down. "No," Zara swallowed. How she hesitated. How different is your world from mine? He held her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Very. The honesty in his voice sent a ripple through her. He hadn't tried to downplay it, hadn't tried to disguise the truth. And yet, there was no arrogance in the admission, only quiet certainty. She exhaled, leaning back slightly. Why didn't you tell me? Matthias studied her for a moment before responding. Because I didn't want it to matter. The simplicity of his answer made her breath catch. He continued, people see the numbers, the lifestyle, and they make assumptions. I didn't want that with you. Zara considered his words. There was no denying that his world was far removed from hers. But as she sat there, watching the way he waited for her reaction, not demanding, not assuming she realized something, it hadn't mattered. Not once in all the time he had spent at the shelter had he ever made her feel like they were from different worlds. He had knelt on the floor with Daisy, taken his time with Benji, listened to her talk about why she loved what she did. The money, the power, it had never been who he was to her. She let out a slow breath. I don't care about that. For the first time that evening, something in his posture eased. No, she shook her head. No, then, after a beat, she added, but I do care about honesty. Matthias nodded, his expression serious now. I won't hide anything from you again. The promise in his voice sent a warmth through her. The conversation shifted after that, turning lighter, easier. They talked about everything: books, travel, the time Zara had tried to foster a cat and failed spectacularly when she realized the tiny creature had decided she was its permanent human. Matthias shared stories of places he had visited, not in the polished way of a man accustomed to luxury, but as someone who had found pieces of himself in different corners of the world. By the time dessert arrived, Zara felt as if an invisible weight had lifted. Matthias watched her with quiet amusement as she took a bite of the decadent chocolate dish, her eyes widening in delight. You're enjoying that more than the entire dinner, he observed. She laughed, unashamed. I have priorities. Something in his expression softened, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her heart stutter. When the evening drew to a close, Matthias didn't call for a check. He merely gave the waiter a subtle nod and the matter was handled. Another quiet reminder of just how different his world was. Outside, the night air was crisp, the city lights casting a golden glow over the quiet streets. Matthias walked beside her, hands in his pockets, his presence steady. After a few steps, he slowed, turning toward her. Come with me for a second. Zara hesitated but found herself nodding. He led her down a small street, away from the bustle, until they reached a park overlooking the water. A single bench sat beneath a street lamp, casting a soft halo of light over the space. They sat in silence for a moment, the distant hum of the city behind them. Then Matthias spoke, his voice quieter now. I don't do this. Zara turned to him. Do what? His fingers flexed slightly against his knee. Let people in. Something in her chest tightened. He looked at her then, fully, as if he were laying something bare. But I want to, with you. The confession settled between them, unguarded, real. Zara took a breath, steadying herself. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Matthias exhaled, his grip tightening around hers. And just like that, something shifted. Not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet, certain way of something inevitable. Matthias drove Zara home that night, his hand resting lightly on the gear shift, his gaze flicking to her between quiet stretches of conversation. The city glowed around them, the streets alive with soft golden light, the occasional hum of distant music spilling from open windows. When they pulled up in front of her apartment building, the moments stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. She hesitated before reaching for the door handle, not quite ready to let the night end. Matthias reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. His touch was warm, steady. I meant what I said earlier, he murmured. I don't let people in easily, but I want her with you. Zara's pulse quickened, her fingers tightening around his. I want that too. His expression softened, something unguarded flashing in his gaze. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her fingers before letting go. Good night, Zara, he said, his voice low. She stepped out of the car, turning back once more before heading inside. He was still watching her, something unreadable in his expression. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was stepping into something real, something that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Matthias became a steady presence in her life. He stopped by the shelter often, sometimes with Daisy, sometimes just to see her between meetings. Their late-night conversations stretched longer, their dinners turning into quiet moments filled with laughter and stolen glances. Zara found herself learning things about him that he rarely shared with the world. The way he preferred handwritten notes over emails, the childhood memories he carried with him from a time before wealth and success had shaped his life. He told her about his father, a man who had built an empire but had rarely been home, and how Matthias had sworn never to let his work consume him the same way. In turn, she told him about her own past. The struggles of keeping the shelter running, the sacrifices she had made to stay in a career that wasn't about money but about purpose. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront, Zara paused, tilting her head toward him. "You never told me why you came to the shelter that first day," Matthias exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the water. "I had a dog when I was a kid. He was the one constant in my life when everything else felt uncertain. I lost him when I was 14. I never got another." Zara's chest tightened. "And Daisy?" His fingers brushed against hers as they walked. "She reminded me what it's like to have someone waiting for you." Her heart clenched at his words. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. Matthias stopped walking, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his grip on her hand tightened. "I've never done this," he admitted quietly. "Never let myself want something real." Zara's breath caught, and now, his gaze held hers. "Now I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. She didn't hesitate. She stepped closer, lifting onto her toes as she pressed her lips against his. Matthias responded instantly, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her against him. The kiss was slow, deep, filled with unspoken promises. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath uneven. "I love you," he murmured. Zara's heart pounded. She had felt it for weeks now, but hearing him say it out loud made everything real. "I love you too," she whispered. Matthias exhaled sharply, as if those words had unraveled something inside him. He kissed her again, slower this time, as if savoring the moment. And Zara knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. Months passed, their lives intertwining in ways neither of them had expected. Matthias became part of her world, just as she became part of his. One evening, he surprised her with a weekend getaway. A secluded cabin nestled in the mountains, away from the demands of the city, away from everything except them. They spent the first night curled up by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Then, just as the sun began to set on the second evening, Matthias turned to her, something unreadable in his expression. "I have something for you," he said. Zara arched a brow. "Should I be worried?" he chuckled, reaching into his pocket before pulling out a small velvet box. Her breath caught. Matthias didn't kneel. He didn't need to. He simply took her hand, his gaze steady. "I never thought I'd find someone who made me want more," he said. "But you did. You changed everything for me, Zara." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. Matthias flipped open the box, revealing a stunning ring, a delicate band with a single, brilliant diamond. "Marry me," he said, his voice raw. "Be mine forever." Zara let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Matthias let out a breath of relief before slipping the ring onto her finger. Then he kissed her, sealing the promise between them. The wedding was a dream, a garden ceremony surrounded by their closest friends. Daisy trotted down the aisle with a small wreath of flowers around her neck, earning a fond chuckle from Matthias as he stood waiting for Zara at the altar. When she walked toward him, her dress flowing around her like something out of a fairy tale, Matthias' breath caught. She had never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at her in that moment. When they exchanged vows, his voice was steady, filled with certainty. "You are my heart, my home, my forever." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "And you are mine." The kiss that followed was met with applause, but Zara barely heard it because all she could feel was Matthias, his hands cradling her face, his lips pressing against hers like a promise. A promise of forever. Years later, Zara stood in their home, watching as Matthias played in the backyard with their daughter. Daisy, now older but still full of life, barked happily as the little girl giggled, chasing after her father. Zara rested a hand on her growing belly, smiling at the sight before her. Matthias turned, catching her gaze. His expression softened, and in an instant he was beside her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happy," he murmured. She leaned into him, feeling the familiar warmth of his embrace. "Completely," she whispered. Matthias cupped her face, his thumb tracing her cheek. "I love you, Zara." She smiled, tilting her head to kiss him. "And I love you." As their daughter's laughter echoed through the air and Daisy barked in the background, Zara knew without a doubt that this was everything she had ever wanted. A love that was real, a love that was forever.